Good morning, Bethlehem Baptist Church. It's good to be with you this morning. Today we are going to be starting a new series in the books of Exodus and Leviticus. We're going to be studying, first starting with Exodus. Today we're going to be in chapters 2 and 3. And I'll give you some context for each of those things and a story that is very familiar to us, but is definitely worth our time and attention to remember, as God has shown his faithfulness to the people of Israel in this way more than most others. And so if you'll join me today in turning to Exodus chapter 2 and 3, our session is entitled Seen and Heard. And I would love to tell you what the main idea of the passage is, but unfortunately I do not have my book with me. And so we'll be just kind of making some comments as we go, but I do know that the main idea of this section is how God remembers his people, that when God sees, God acts. He does things to fulfill his covenantal promises. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today in chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the book of Exodus. And I just want to give you some context from chapter 1 before we move into the text itself in chapter 2. So as you know, Joseph, in our previous study back in Genesis, we ended with Joseph. And there he became the second in charge of the people of Egypt. He became the right-hand man to Pharaoh. And under his leadership, the Egyptian people were mightily prosperous. And this is also true of the Israelites. And if you remember at the end of the book, all of his brothers and his father, Jacob, came into the land of Egypt during that famine, during that drought, and they stayed in Egypt, and that was where they began to build a life. Now, please let us not forget the covenant that was given to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob about returning to the promised land. But what has happened, and this was prophesied back with Abraham, I believe, in Genesis 15. I'm going to pull this up here real quick. Let me turn there. In Genesis 15, when we see that covenant that God makes with Abraham, we see here, Genesis 15, starting in verse 12, it says, "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And the Lord said to Abraham, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Now remember, this is where God goes and does the covenant by himself. So verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the covenantal pieces. All right, so in this time, in the Abrahamic covenant, we are given a couple of interesting pieces of information. The first is that he's making a covenant with Abraham to give him a promised land. But for 400 years, he is not going to receive that land. That the people of Israel would suffer as sojourners and slaves in a land that is not their own. So that's number one thing that we see there. And then you'll notice that, and this is just a little cool tidbit of information from Genesis 15 as well. You'll notice that the covenantal pieces that were walked between, remember Abraham is asleep during that time, and so God walks through the covenantal pieces by himself. But how does he do it? Through fire and smoke. That is going to become very significant. That imagery from the Abrahamic covenant will become very significant when we get to later parts of the book of Exodus. And so hold on to that thought, but I'll give you a hint so that you don't forget it in the future. If you recall, the people of Israel were led to the wilderness wandering by a pillar of cloud or a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire. And so we see that the Lord continues the Abrahamic covenant and moves on to Moses himself. So 400 years is the promised time of suffering for the people of Israel. And so what we see in chapter 1 of Exodus is exactly this. So chapter 1, it says, these are the names of the sons of Israel. And then he lists the names of the sons of Jacob that had become the main people of Egypt. And then verse 6 of that, it says, then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all of that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. God blessed the Israelite people richly, and they began to expand and have children and multiply greatly. And so what happens then, and this is where we see the conflict begin in the story, verse 8 of chapter 1, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. 400 years have passed. And now the pharaohs of Egypt, the kings of Egypt, no longer remember the histories. They no longer remember what happened with Joseph and how Joseph's people rescued the land of Egypt. They no longer remember any of those things. And instead, they say, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. And so therefore, what happens? Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, and they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and all kinds of work in the field. And all the work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Sipherah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women to see them on their birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, they shall live. So what are they attempting to do here? They're attempting to do the exact same thing that communist China attempted to do with girls. Right? If it's a son, keep the son alive. But if it's a girl, murder it. That way we don't have an overpopulation issue, except they're doing it this way with sons instead of daughters. And so they begin to encourage this, but the Hebrew midwives fear God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before midwives come into them. So they lie to the Egyptian Pharaoh. And so God dealt well with the Hebrew midwives, and people multiplied, and they grew even stronger. And because the Hebrew midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. And so what we see here is a patterned history of suffering of the people of Israel. These people are enslaved. They're made to do hard labor in the fields. They're made to do brick and mortar from mud and straw and hay, and it's become a huge burden, a problem. And in order to deal with the increasing population, Pharaoh has now resulted into murdering their children. So what we see in Exodus 1 is the painted picture of true embittered evil. And I don't want us to just look at this from a perspective of like, oh, it's a political thing, right? The Egyptians are afraid for their power. They're afraid for, fill in the blank, bad things to happen. I want you to see this also in the spiritual sense. Let us not forget what we've read in Genesis. The Abrahamic covenant that goes through Isaac and through Jacob is one that says that there will be a son of man who will crush the serpent's head. He will be a seed of Abraham. It should not shock us or surprise us that Satan is still at work, that evil is still at work to destroy the seed of man. Remember, I just brought up that the Communist Party in China has decided that they want to, and they've done this for decades, that they want to deal with the population issue. So what do? They kill women. They don't kill men. They limit the amount of children that you can have. Why men in this section? Men aren't the ones that give birth. One man can get as many women pregnant as he wants. Women can only be pregnant at once per baby, And so why men instead? Well, because Satan is at work. Satan knows that the seed of Abraham through these Hebrew people is going to be the one that puts an end to sin and death. And so in this, I don't want you to just see this as a physical thing. I don't want you to just see this as a oh wow, it's a generation of children killed. Yes, that is a tragedy. That's a horrible thing. But more than that, it is a spiritual warfare. Satan himself is standing against the people of God. And he is murdering the firstborns, or the children, the men of Israel. And the reason he's doing this is because he knows that the seed of Abraham will be a man. So now we get introduced to a person, and I want you to see the parallels between this person and Jesus. Because if we walk through the entire book of Exodus, we're going to see how Moses is an incredible leader and does a lot of wonderful things and some bad things as well. But generally speaking, we see a very incredible man of God and a man of righteousness. And I want you to see the parallels between Moses and Jesus so that you can understand that when Jesus comes on the scene, he looks like another rescuer of Israel, and the parallels between the Exodus story and what God has done through casting away sin in Jesus Christ they're wonderful. They're wonderful, right? So already Moses is being born in a time in which the Hebrew boys are being slaughtered. Does that sound familiar to Jesus' birth? Where the king comes and says, kill any child, any male child under the age of 3. Sound familiar to you? All right, this is where we're going to jump into our text in chapter 2. It says this, so now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took him in a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. And now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the girl went out and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So isn't it interesting how God provides for this? She sets her son out in the Nile River in a floating basket, and then it's picked up by Pharaoh's daughter, who then says, oh, you look like you could probably take care of a child and nurse a child. Why don't you take this? And she gives Moses right back to her mother. And her mother continues to nurse at her breast. But then it says this, so the woman took the child and nursed him, and when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Moses, the name Moses sounds like the Hebrew word for drawn out. So we see that as Moses grows up, we see that he grows up in palace life. All right, so he is famously called in the DreamWorks movie a Prince of Egypt. We get that he's a Prince of Egypt, but I would say that movie, if you've seen it, does take some liberties in what kind of a prince he is. We see that in that particular movie that he is considered a very high-ranking person. We don't get that in the text. The text goes straight to the moment where he murders an Egyptian, and we will see that he flees not because of his shame and things like that, but he actually flees because the Pharaoh desires to kill Moses, so he flees out of fear for his life. So let's read that. One day, Verse 11, when Moses had grown up, he went out to the people, to his people, and looked upon their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Notice in one verse, we are reminded that Moses is a Hebrew. He says he goes out to see one of his people. And it says he sees an Egyptian beating one of his people. The reason for the repetition here, and remember the author of this book is Moses himself. The reason why he is showing us this repetition is to remind us that even though he may have grown up in palace life, he has not forgotten his roots. He understands that he is a Hebrew. Right, verse 12, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid in the sand. Here we see a very interesting perspective on who this Moses is. Moses, seeing that nobody is watching, which would already indicate a level of low integrity. Seeing that no one is watching, he goes and defends the person who's being attacked by murdering one of the Egyptians. So, verse 13, and when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? So he sees two Hebrews who are fighting now, and he confronts them. Why are you fighting each other? And it says this, the man who's in the wrong answered, who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you did the Egyptian? And so what we see here is a very cool foreshadowing. Who has put you in charge of the Hebrew people? Well, no one just yet, but we're going to see in chapter 3 the person who will. But what we see here is that Moses shows a concern for his people. Not just for their slavery in Egypt, but also a concern for righteousness among the people. He desires for them to walk rightly with one another as well as with the Lord. But what I find interesting is that one minute we're murdering somebody, the next minute we're concerned for our kinsmen fighting each other. And of course they do what anybody would do in terms of hypocrisy. They call him out on his hypocrisy, and this is where we see Pharaoh finds out, right? So, who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill us as you did the Egyptian? And then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Right? So Pharaoh finds out that Moses, who is a Hebrew, and we have not forgotten that he's a Hebrew, Moses has done an evil thing. And so Pharaoh seeks to take his life. And so at that, Moses flees from Pharaoh and goes to the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. So as he goes to the land of Midian, this is where we see him meet Zipporah, his wife. He has a child named Gershom, which means a sojourner. And there his father Jephthah begins to, he begins to become a shepherd, basically. And this is right leading up to the kind of the inciting incident of our story. We've got the introduction of the setting, the conflict, where we see, the people of Israel are crying out to the Lord God. They are in suffering, and God has begun to bring about a shepherd. And so I want to focus now on, we're going to just go down through chapter 3, verse 15. But I want you to see, just real quick, look at the end of chapter 2, because this is the significance of the passage. Right now, it's great. We're hearing about Moses. We're hearing about what's happening to the Israelites in the 400 years that they were in Egypt, and that's all well and good. But listen to this. This is the crux of the passage. This is what sets the entire events in motion. You ready? Verse 22, or 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. And they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw that the people of Israel, and God knew. So there are 4 attributes, 4 actions that are attributed to God as the people of Israel cry out. We see God hears their groaning. So he is attentively listening to what the people of Israel are saying. Number 2, he remembers his covenant with them. He remembers his faithfulness to them, and he remembers that after 400 years, he is going to rescue them. Now, I want to be very clear on this. It's not that God forgot. It's not that God forgot. Remember, I read for you the passage at the beginning of this where he said to Abraham, 400 years they will be in slavery. 400 years they're going to suffer. It is not that God forgot. It's that this has been in the sovereign plan, that God had waited until now. And now, as he remembers, his remembering does 2 things. Number 1, he sees the people of Israel. He looks upon their affliction, and he is broken for it. And the second is he knows. Not only does he see it, but he feels it personally, and he knows it himself. And here's the one thing that we learn about God more than anything else in the book of Exodus. When God knows, when God sees, when God remembers, when God hears, he acts. When God sees, remembers, hears, and knows, he also acts. He does not allow his people to go unheard, unseen, unremembered, and unknown. He draws his sovereign plan into place. When God sees, God acts. And so that's exactly what we see next. And I want you to highlight that in your text, verses 23 through 24 of chapter 2. This is the main idea that we're going to see in the book of Exodus, because whatever Moses does on the authority and the power of God. So far in Genesis, we had not really seen any crazy miracles, right? We had seen how the people had faith in God, and they were it was credited to them as righteousness, and God did miracles directly to them. But we have not yet seen what happens when a man of God who's indwelled with God's Spirit, what the power he is capable of just yet. All right, so let's now look at chapter 3. But I want you to remember, God is now going to intervene. God is going to step down from his throne, and he's going to start acting on behalf of the people of Israel. And so what we see is that, remember back in the Genesis, that honing in on Messiah, the seed of Abraham. And now we're going to see what this looks like through a shepherd, Moses. So, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Isn't that interesting that we have another mountain here? And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses, he said. Here I am. Then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. All right, now this is a really cool moment here. Moses is walking up to a burning bush where the holiness of God is lighting this thing on fire, but it's not consumed. And there we see a very significant thing that Isaiah actually picks up later in the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, which we'll be studying here shortly. Moses goes to enter into the presence of God. And what he does is he's allowed to walk on holy ground, but he must take off his sandals. There can be nothing between him and the Lord. If you ever remember from Isaiah chapter 6, it says, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted. The train of his robe filled the temple and the earth. It says, above him were angels with 6 wings. With 2 they cover their faces. With 2 they cover their feet. And with 2 they're flying. Even angels do not have the authority to stand before a holy God on holy ground. They must be continually flying and never letting their feet touch the ground. and yet man has the ability. The Lord has chosen to bless man, to honor man, that we can stand before his holiness. So look at this. He says, he stands there, his sandals off of his feet, and he says, he hears from the Lord, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses, at this point, recognizes who he's talking to, and it says that he hides his face. This is the true response to being met with a holy God. A fear, because you and I are sinful. I love what R.C. Sproul says about this. He says that in the same way that, and I'm sorry, I'm looking around for my R.C. Sproul book to see if I can actually quote it for you, but I don't see it. It must be upstairs. But what we see, R.C. Sproul talks about this in Isaiah chapter 6 as well. He says, what is it that Isaiah does the second that he is made aware of God's presence? He says, woe to me, I am ruined. He is exceedingly afraid, and he desires to be anywhere else but in front of God. And then he likens this to a passage in the New Testament where Jesus is on the boat and he calms the wind and the waves, right? The storm is raging and he calms the wind and the waves. And what's Peter's response? Peter's response is not, wow, that was cool. Peter's response is, who is this that can command the wind and the waves? And he was greatly afraid. When we encounter true holiness and true power, it draws us to deep and abiding fear. And this is exactly what we're seeing with Moses here. It's not just it's not a casual covering my face because it's too bright. There is a moment in which Moses recognizes, I am not supposed to be here. He averts his eyes in honor. He bows his head before the Lord, and he hides his face. And look, it tells us exactly why in the passage, verse 6, for he was afraid to look upon God. Verse 7, then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, and I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and with honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Notice that God repeats all of those things to Moses that he has seen and heard and remembered. But notice what he says in this passage. He now says, I have come to deliver. When God sees, God acts. So he says, and now, behold, verse 9, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression in which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And I want us to just take a moment to realize that we could see this in a couple of ways. One, I don't believe it's wrong for us to look at this as a vision of humility. We know that Moses is the humblest man so far that has ever existed. And so I would look at this primarily from that perspective, that Moses is humble, that he does not think himself a leader or someone that can do the things that God is asking. But I also wonder if this is said out of fear. He fears death from going back to the land of Egypt, and that would be a reasonable fear. But the reason why I lean more towards the humility than the fear is also because if he's afraid of death, he's standing before a holy God. If you are watching even something simple like a burning bush, which, by the way, is not simple, but even if you're looking at something as mild in comparison to seeing God in his actual throne room, part of me thinks that I would be afraid to disobey. And so I don't see this, at least, and this is my understanding. I know other commentators have said differently. I don't see this as a form of disobedience. I don't see this as a form of his fear of being killed back in Egypt. I see this as a true position of humility where he says, I don't know if I'm capable of doing this. And the reason why I say this especially is because in the text what we see is God's response. if he were being, flagrantly disobedient, willfully disobedient, when I tell my kids, hey, don't do that anymore, and then they look at me while they do it again, right? He's not doing that. Instead, what we see is a gentleness of God who offers himself. Look at this. And I want you to see the difference between Abraham and this. It's not just it's not just that Abraham, hey, you're going to be my people, I'm going to be your God. But he's going to tell Moses something that's never been said before. I will go with you. So look at this. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go and bring Pharaoh and to Pharaoh and bring the children out of Egypt? Verse 12. And God said, but I will be with you. And this shall be a sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Israel, you shall serve God on this mountain. And so we see something here where it's almost a reinitiation of that Abrahamic covenant, which is really cool. I will be your God, you will be my people, I will be with you. But I also want to, again, draw this parallel. Have you ever heard God say to a group of people before, I will be with you? Or let me rephrase it in a different way. Behold, I am with you until the very end of the age. You see where I'm going with this? All right, verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, and this is the first time that we see the true name of God. What we understand is the name Yahweh is representative of this. I am who I am, or I am what I am, or I am what I will be. In other words, we see the word to be. Not only is God in the future, he will be. Not only God is, not only God was. This name of God represents so much. It represents, number one, and I'm going to give you some linguistics here. Number one, it represents a past, present, and future. It shows the eternality of God. It shows the significance of the eternality of God, that he always was and always will be. And that is significant because nothing in all of other creation is eternal. Everything else has, at the very least, a beginning point and an end point. But in addition to this, there's the specific word here is what we call a being verb. Now, you may remember back when you were a kid about being verbs. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been, right? You may remember those linking verbs and what those do in a sentence structure. But I want to go one step further in grammar that you may have ever gone before, and that is to understand that being verbs are not just significant because of what they do in a sentence as a linking verb. It's not just that if I say, I am Colin, or I am Colin, I am a father, I am a pastor, right? It's not just linking two things together as equals. But especially in different languages, there are more than one concept of being known or being a part of something, right? So, for example, in the New Testament, there are a couple of different words for being. There's a concept of being, the simple verb to be. I, me, I am. I, me is the Greek word for that translates to I am. But there's also another one, ginomai. Ginomai is also a being verb, but it means I know, I understand, I am one with. This is actually where we get the concept of the biblical thing of I know my spouse, right? An intimacy with one's spouse, a one-fleshness, to be known by God or to be known by a spouse, right? That being known is a being verb. And so the reason why I'm taking time to do this is I want you to understand that being verbs specifically, especially in Hebrew and Greek, are a form of existence. And so when God says, I am that I am, it's not just an expression of eternality, but it is also an expression of self-existence. That God did not need to be created. He was not born. He was not made. But rather, he just is. And not only is he, but also all things are because he is. I'm going to say that again. All things are. All of the things that you know, all the things that you understand, your own mind and how you understand yourself and what you are as a person, all of that exists because he made it that way, because he primarily is. You and I are not self-existent. We exist because our mother and our father came together in their DNA and created us. And your brain works the way it does because God began to form it in such patterns and pathways that you think about those things. This mouse in front of me, this book that I have in front of me, all of these things, whether it's abstract knowledge through words and pictures, or whether it's physical knowledge through the holding of a mechanical device, a key, all of these things exist, but they are not self-existent. When God says, I am that I am, it breathes of not just his eternality, but also the fact that he exists within himself and there is no origin. So when he says, I am, he literally means it. I am. You are. But you are only what you have been made to be. I am not, right? You know how I'm not? Right now, this is a coffee cup. I am not a coffee cup. I am not anything else but what I am supposed to be, what I've been made to be. God has no making. He just is. He just is. Now, I want to be very clear on this because, and I know I'm not being clear, this is clear as mud because we're trying to understand the concept of God, which is impossible for us to even fathom, but I'm hoping that we're sinking our teeth into something worth chewing. In addition to the fact that God is, in addition to the fact that he is self-existent, we also have to recognize that he's not all things. This isn't a transcendental idea that God is also coffee cup, and God is also book, and God is also cell phone, right? He's not these things. These things come from him. They find their origin in him. All matter, all thought, abstract and physical, everything, spiritual, derives from God. But he is not identified by those things. The only ways that we are able to actually talk about God or to understand God are ways that he has revealed to us through his scripture. We cannot know him fully. We cannot understand him fully because we are neither self-existent nor are we eternal. This name of God carries with it a significant and huge theological impact for what he is doing for the people of Israel. Because not only does it show his eternality and his self-existence, but it also shows his immense power. That because all things come from him, he is then able to affect all things. So when God sees, God hears, God remembers, and God acts, he acts with authority and power. All of that is wrapped up in his name. I am who I am. So when God says this, I would imagine that as Moses is processing this, that he does this the same way I process this, which is like, oh, the more I think about the implications of this, oh, the more I glory in the fact that what does it mean to be eternal? What does it mean to be self-existent? What does it mean to not be anything, but rather to be existent in one's self, to not be able to identify as anything? Because you don't have to. Identity is submissive to you. God's authority, God's eternality, God's power, and God's self-existence are all wrapped up in his name. And I could go on for even more, but I think those characteristics truly ring out from this passage. So then he said, say to this people of Israel, I am has sent you. And God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So as we wrap up our time today, I want you to just marvel in the character of who God is and how he reveals himself. But he also recognizes that 400 years have gone by. The people are not going to remember I am that I am. But when we associate God's character in his name with also who he has associated with before, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we see the true glory of God, that he is not just a God of power and authority, a God of self-existence and eternity, but he is also a God of love, grace, mercy, and he remembers his covenantal promises. He is a faithful God. And so in this, brothers and sisters, the application is very clear. One, we worship. Not only has this God been made known to us through the reading of his word, but he has, I want to take you just to Hebrews 1 and 2 for just a moment, so that you can see the true revelation of the I am that I am. Long ago, at many times and in various ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, and through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the power of his word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. Let me read again here so that you can see this. This is not just an abstract version of God. Wrong book. Here we go. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and to testify it and proclaim to you eternal life, which was the Father and was made manifest to us, that which we have seen and heard, and we proclaim to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us indeed, and our fellowship with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. God is now testifying through his Son, Jesus, and just as a final reminder of the eternality of Jesus, that is a man, right? We've seen him with our eyes, we've touched him with our hands, we've heard him with our ears. He is truly God and truly man. And then we see this beautiful hymn that is in the book of Colossians. And I want you to see this as just the form of worship today. This is something worth our time and attention. So verse 15 of Colossians 1, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones and dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, and everything, that he might be preeminent. For in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether on earth or heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. This is our King Jesus, the eternal one of God, the I am that I am, the better Moses. And here we see the true, what it means that he is, that his name is, that he is. All things are held together by him, and I want to leave our final application with this in Colossians. All things were made for him. The chief end of man is the glory of God. As we think about what we're going to be doing in our study of Exodus, and we're going to be remembering God's faithfulness to his people, and as we come into this Advent season and we remember the Christ who was born in a manger for us, and he was born for the purpose of dying. He was born so that we may live. Let us not remember that all things in creation were designed and made for the glory of God. You today, brother and sister, are an image of God. You're made in his image. You're not the firstborn. You are not the one in which the fullness of God is pleased to dwell. That is reserved for Christ alone. He is the preeminent one. But in the same way, we will get to experience a taste of who he is. We will get to experience eternality, not from the beginning of all things, but we will live forever with him in the eternal life that he gives. In this, we don't get to be self-existent, but we get to be unified with the one who is. In this, we don't get to be perfectly faithful, but one day we will be. And so as we worship, as our lives go on throughout our day and we think about the next step of what we're to do ahead, keep this in mind that whatever you do, in word or in deed, do all things for the glory of God. Brothers and sisters, I love you. Let me pray for you and we'll get out of here. Gracious Heavenly Father, I'd take a moment to just worship who you are, that you are self-existent, that you are not able to be comprehended by any man, that you are eternal. But God, more than those attributes that just show off your immense authority and power, you are also a God who loves. You are a God who remembers. You are a God who is concerned with the suffering of his people. You are a God who is compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And Father, I praise you that you are a God of power, that when you see, you act. And so God, today, I pray for those who are suffering. I pray for my close friends and my family. I pray for the people in our church that are enduring all sorts of suffering, whether it be from disease or death, whether it be from hardship in marriage or difficulty with children. God, I pray for Bethlehem. I pray for your people. I pray that you would hear our cry, that you would hear us, that you would see us, that you would remember us, and that you would know us. And so, God, I pray that you would continue to fulfill your word that says that all things work together for the good of those who love you and who are called according to your purpose. And so let us walk today with purpose, Father God, that whatever sufferings we endure will bring glory to your name. Above all, we thank you for Christ, who is the better Moses. We thank you for Christ, who brings not just the law, but the fulfillment of the law. And so, Father, as we study in your word in Exodus, I pray that you would make Christ known to us more and more every day. I thank you for who you are. I thank you for what you've done. And I praise you above all for Jesus. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. Brothers and sisters, I love you. I'll see you next week.